Without the frequently heroic efforts of the advanced thinking publishers and editors, most of them women, of a handful of small literary magazines, the cultural movement we know and cherish today as modernism would simply not exist as we now recognize it. Most of the greatest works of modernism appeared first not as books at all, but in the pages of small literary journals like The Dial or The Little Review or The Egoist. T.S. Eliot's first great work, Prufrock, appeared in the June 1915 issue of Harriet Monroe's poetry magazine. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea-girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. The novels of James Joyce, who gave a more complete and less censored or idealized version of the truth of human life than perhaps any writer previously, ran into enormous problems with the censors, with publishers and printers who balked at his commitment to a full, unredacted truthfulness in his art. Irish, British, and American book publishers wouldn't touch Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. So this woman, Dora Marsden, along with Harriet Shaw Weaver, published it in serial form in their little magazine, The Egoist. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Taku. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was Baby Taku, the moo cow coming down the road where Betty Byrne lived. She sold lemon platt. Oh, the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. He sang that song. That was his song. Oh, the green walth bethoth. When you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. His mother put on the oil sheet. That had the queer smell. His mother had a nicer smell than his father. She played on the piano the sailor's hornpipe for him to dance. He danced, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-laddie, tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la. Uncle Charles and Dante clapped. They were older than his father and mother, but Uncle Charles was older than Dante. Dante had 2 brushes in her press. The brush with the maroon velvet back was from Michael Davitt, and the brush with the green velvet back was for Parnell. Dante gave him a kuchu every time he brought her a piece of tissue paper. The Vances lived in number 7. They had a different father and mother. They were Eileen's father and mother. When they were grown up, he was going to marry Eileen. He hid under the table. His mother said, "Oh, Stephen will apologize." Dante said, "Oh, if not, the eagles will come and pull out his eyes. Pull out his eyes. Apologize. Apologize. Pull out his eyes. Apologize. Pull out his eyes. Pull out his eyes. Apologize." It would be almost 3 years later that the work was finally published in book form by the American firm of Hupsch. But in The Egoist, you will find many of the great poems, essays, and novels of modernism in their earliest appearance. Here is Hilda Dolittle, or H.D.'s deeply moving poem called Circe. It was easy enough to bend them to my wish. It was easy enough to alter them with a touch. But you, adrift on the great sea, how shall I call you back? Cedar and white ash, rock cedar and sand plants and tamarisk, red cedar and white cedar and black cedar, from the inmost forest fragrance upon fragrance, and all of my sea magic is for naught. It was easy enough, a thought called them, from the sharp edges of the earth. They prayed for a touch, they cried for the sight of my face. They entreated me, till in pity I turned each to his own self. panther and panther, then a black leopard follows close, black panther and red, and a great hound, a godlike beast, cut the sand in a clear ring and shut me from the earth, and cover the sea sound with their throats, and the sea roar with their own barks and billowings and snarls, and the sea stars and the swirl of the sand and the rock tamarisk and the wind resonance, but not your voice. It is easy enough to call men from the edges of the earth. It is easy enough to summon them to my feet with a thought. It is beautiful to see the tall panther and the sleek deerhounds circle in the dark. It is easy enough to make cedar and white ash fumes into palaces and to cover the sea caves with onyx and ivory. But I would give up the rock fringes of coral and the inmost chamber of my island palace and my own gifts and the whole region of my power and magic for your glance. And in 1919, after numerous publishers had balked at the idea of publishing Ulysses, then a work in progress, it too appeared in the pages of the Egoist. Do you see T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent? It is perhaps the most famous of all literary essays of the period, and that too found its first appearance in Dora Marsden's and Harriet Shaw Weaver's The Egoist. Simultaneously, Ulysses was being published in the astonishing small magazine, The Little Review, the magazine that is read by those who write the others. It is such a bold claim, but one glance at the masthead and the lineup of writers, and you suddenly realize it is a completely accurate claim. Just look at this. September 1918, in memory of Robert Gregory William Butler Yeats. The Western School, Edgar Jepson. 4 poems, T.S. Eliot. Ulysses, Episode 6. James Joyce. A Story, Senility by Sherwood Anderson. Decay by Ben Hecht. Books by John Rutker. The Notes for Ivory Tower by Ezra Pound. Women and Men, Part 6 by Ford Madox Huffer, who would later change his name to Ford Madox Ford. And if you want to see just how truly advanced and radical and forward-thinking the lineup is, compare it to other more popular magazines from the period. Even if you're a literary historian, you simply aren't going to recognize most of these names, even though many of them were among the most popular writers of the day. Of course, there's Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs, but the other names, they have just faded into the mists of the unknown. It is the now famous writers who appeared in the Little Review who were mostly unknown at the time and whose work was often considered controversial. Earlier, I referred to the publishers of these small magazines as heroic. They were. They risked not only financial loss and even ruin by publishing unknown writers, but risked legal trouble with the censors. Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson were both fined, had their magazines confiscated, and even spent time in jail for the crime of publishing Ulysses. Together, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson did so much to promote the avant-garde artists and writers of the period. There they are on the right of this remarkable photograph. And who else is in the picture? Left to right, the great modernist sculptor Constantine Brancusi. And then the brilliant writer, artist, and performance artist and film director Tristan Tzara. And next to Tzara is the great American photographer Bernice Abbott. And then a poet whose work I love, Mina Loy, who I will be discussing in an upcoming video on the November 1922 Wasteland issue of the Dial. And finally, there's Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson. So let's take a closer look at their September 1918 issue of the Little Review. We are in the Hades chapter of Joyce's masterful book, and Leopold Bloom is musing to himself after just attending the funeral and burial of his Dublin friend Digdom. The gates glimmered in front, still open. Back to the world again. Enough of this place. A little goes a long way, brings you a bit nearer every time. Last time I was here Was Mrs. Snicko's funeral give you the creeps after a bit? Plenty to see and hear and feel yet. Feel live, warm beings near you. Let them sleep in their maggoty beds. They are not going to get me this inning. Warm beds, full-blooded life. And Yeats's poem in memory of Robert Gregory, it ends, I had thought, seeing how bitter is that wind that shakes the shutter, to have brought to mind all those that manhood tried, or childhood loved, or boyish intellect approved, with some appropriate commentary on each, until imagination brought a fitter welcome. But a thought of that late death took all my heart for speech. And what of 4 poems by T.S. Eliot? We have Whispers of Immortality. Webster was much possessed by death. And of course he's talking about the Jacobean playwright John Webster, who was obsessed with the macabre and with death and with the extremes of human experience, and in works like The Duchess of Malfi carved open a whole new territory of experience on the edge, which Eliot found extremely apt for his own time of post-war upheaval and psychological decentering. Webster was much possessed by death and saw the skull beneath the skin, and breastless creatures underground leaned backward with a lipless grin. Daffodil bulbs instead of balls stared from the sockets of the eyes. He knew that thought clings round dead limbs, tightening its lusts and luxuries. Donne, I suppose, was such another who found no substitute for sense to seize and clutch and penetrate, expert beyond experience. He knew the anguish of the marrow, the ague of the skeleton. No contact possible to flesh allayed the fever of the bone. Grishkin is nice. Her Russian eye is underlined for emphasis, uncorseted. Her friendly bust gives promise of pneumatic bliss. The couched Brazilian jaguar compels the scampering marmoset with subtle effluence of a cat. Grishkin has a maisonette. The sleek and sinuous jaguar does not in its arboreal gloom distill so rank a feline smell as Grishkin in a drawing room, and even abstract entities circumambulate her charm, but our lot crawls between dry ribs to keep our metaphysics warm. Okay, this is the third in a series of videos done for the reading group T.S. Eliot in August, looking at Eliot and other themes in modernism. Tomorrow, I am going to be taking a deep dive into the utterly fascinating November 1922 issue of The Dial, in which T.S. Eliot's epochal poem, The Wasteland, first appeared in the United States. And I want to use the issue to explore the broad-based cultural context in which the poem first appeared, because it features a remarkable Cubist painting by Robert Dalloway and The Player Queen by William Butler Yeats, and a poem about Brancusi's sculpture, The Golden Bird by Mina Loy. And The Wasteland is flanked by other treasures as well, including an excerpt from a serialized story by the controversial and risque Viennese novelist and friend of Gustav Klimt's Arthur Schnitzler, a couple Picasso drawings, some fairly risque drawings by the Bloomsbury artist Duncan Grant, and other treasures by Sherwood Anderson and Ezra Pound and Bertrand Russell, Malcolm Cowley, and I will use these to give a contextual reading of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope to see you back here tomorrow.